Hello, and welcome to now episode 8 of season 3, where we focus on the post Jewish genocide reality. And I'm very honored to welcome my guest, Ken Abramowitz, who's the founder of Save the West. Ken, we were introduced, I remember, at Mar-a-Lago by our mutual friend, Rebecca Harari. And I remember when you gave me your card, I always look at business cards immediately after events. And the name of your initiative really intrigued me because having been a Zionist since 2014, for those who may not know, I'm the CEO and founder of Taking Back the Narrative. What I'm finding is that so many initiatives just skim the surface, if they even do discuss geopolitics. And what I noticed from your initiative, Save the West, each and every webinar that I have tuned into really delves into this under the surface of the headlines. So if we're going to delve a little bit more for the duration of the episode about all of the topics that are germane to today's situation. Again, I don't call it a conflict. I call it a war on Jews. It has been going on for 100 years, but especially for those who want to have more insight into what is going on with Israel, with Gaza. For those who may not know, Gaza is part of Israel, still is per Article 80, and all of the other international issues relating to Islam and terrorism. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you can give a brief introduction, and then we're going to get into more details about Save the West.
Sure. Well, as you discussed, I'm Kenneth Abramowitz. I'm the founder of SaveTheWest.com. Save the West is a website dedicated to saving Western civilization from all of its enemies. It's a thought of mine of about 10 years now. And it actually started earlier on 9/11. At that time, I was a healthcare analyst on Wall Street, worked 6 days a week studying the healthcare industry. And when 9/11 took place, my reaction was that I, as an individual citizen, have to do something. And what should I do? Now, since I'm an analyst and I only know how to do one thing, I analyze. So I said to myself, I'm going to analyze why 9/11 took place, who did it, why'd they do it, who didn't stop them. And I embarked on a 10-year effort, 1 day a week, to teach myself national security. I then set up SaveTheWest.com. I then started writing articles every 2 weeks. And then about 4 years ago, I wrote a book called The Multi-Front War. When I pieced together what I thought was happening, and I monitor 100 different issues, and I look at the interrelationship of everything to everything. And about 8 years ago, I started giving speeches. I give 100 speeches a year.
Wow,
on
impressive.
how to save Western civilization. So I now spend 3 days a week on national security and Save the West. As a public service, 3 days a week, I still work as a healthcare analyst and advisor and investor in the healthcare field. So I do two at the same time. And
So
I rest on Shabbat.
Perfect. That sounds like a really productive schedule. So I will be happy to link to your book under the episode, just so people can find it easily. And so that was going to be my next question. Is this something that you're doing full time or part time? And you mentioned that you're still doing your healthcare analysis work, right? A couple of days a week. So how is SaveTheWest.com? How is that being received by your non-geopolitical colleagues, and do they even know about it? And if you can give us a little bit more color to that.
Well, I live in two separate worlds. I live in the healthcare business world, and I live in the public service national security world. There's only about a 1 or 2% overlap between those two worlds. People in healthcare and finance want to talk about healthcare and finance. People in national security want to talk about national security. So I keep the two separate and distinct from each other. And If I were still in college, you'd call me a double major. And I enjoy each of them, and I use similar techniques in each of them. In healthcare, I started off studying different segments of healthcare, and then as I got older, I put together a comprehensive vision of what's going on in healthcare. And I did the same in national security. I studied individual countries or individual organizations, and then put it together in my Multi-Front War book, where I discuss the interrelationship of 100 different issues to each other. So I use similar analytical techniques, but other than that, I keep my two worlds separate.
That's probably smart. So you're not being canceled, at least not yet, which is good because we all know how being truth tellers can be received. Like I know in my own personal career, so I started off in the corporate world, then I worked in the nonprofit world, and this was even before I was a Zionist. I became a Zionist in 2014. I was actually fairly anti-Israel for about 20 years. For those who are listening who might not know, and even I was disturbed by the level of anti-Semitism that I was finding at my nonprofit job at Weill Cornell that had nothing to do with politics whatsoever. So my question to you is, how was Save the West received when you first launched it? I mean, from my own personal experience, I know that there is a lot of uphill battle, pushback sometimes, at least that I've experienced when wanting to use accurate terminology relating to Israel, when wanting to shed light on topics that should have more focus on. So, what was your personal experience when this first launched?
Well, in the beginning, I had many friends who thought I was exaggerating or I was too extreme.
Mhm.
And I should stick to healthcare because that's I was well known in healthcare, and there was no reason for me to branch out to national security. Now, when I meet friends, they say, uh, I used to think you were too extreme,
Mhm.
and I didn't like hearing from you. But I realized that you were right all along, and I was wrong. And thank you very much for persevering. So that's what I hear from people. It's very gratifying to hear that.
Of course. And what are some of your immediate goals with your initiative?
I'm trying to save Western civilization. Now, Western civilization is just a fancy term for democracy.
Mhm.
So, and about half the people in the world live in a democracy, half the people live in a dictatorship. The dictatorships have declared war on the democracy, so we're in a state of war. We don't know that, but we are. And I call it World War III. It's actually been going on a long time. As we talk
Absolutely.
some more, I'll explain to you it's World War I also. And I have a lot of fun characterizing what I call World War III, trying to give ideas, particularly to congressmen, senators, governors, attorney generals, people surrounding Trump, people surrounding Netanyahu. I try to give them friendly observations and uh, uh, some suggestions of how they can save Western civilization. Politicians, as you know, are short-term oriented.
Of course.
I and you, most citizens, particularly with kids, grandkids, and hopefully great grandkids, we become long term oriented. So there's always a conflict of interest between a senator or whoever has to get elected November 5th and a citizen who's thinking about several generations ahead, let's just say 100 years into the future, as opposed to 2 months into the future. But I try to have ideas that make sense short term, and I have ideas that make sense long term. And I know when the right time to emphasize
Mhm.
the short term and long term are. And similarly, when I give speeches to the public, I try to highlight and separate short term and long term ideas.
And that's very prudent of you to offer both. And something that you said that we are in World War III, I'm just mystified of anyone who does not understand that we are in World War III. We've been in World War III for, I mean, you could correct me on this, but I think since at least 9/11. And because each world war looks different, right? World War II looked very different than World War I. World War III, which we're in right now, in my understanding, is a proxy war. You have Iran that's fighting various nations through proxies, obviously one of them Israel and America. You have the Chinese that are using their proxies. America is using proxies. The African nations, I believe there's there's several active wars in Africa right now, but I believe one of them is Chad and Libya, if I'm not mistaken, and the UAE is getting involved. Also, French have been all over the African continent recently with their troops. So, to my understanding, it's very much a proxy World War III that we are in the middle of right now. What would be some of your thoughts on that?
Well, World War I and World War II were fought over there,
Mhm.
Europe, Far East. World War III, I quote the Beatles, the World War III is here, there, and everywhere.
Right.
So we're fighting bad guys abroad, we're fighting bad guys in the US. Now, just because a map, if you look at a world map, it says, oh, China's over there. That doesn't mean they're not here.
Of
And if
course.
Iran's over there, then they're here. And what I've learned is all the bad guys that are over there are also here. And so that's why I say it's here, there, and everywhere. And basically, every country is fighting every country everywhere.
Mhm.
So that's why people get a sense of chaos. And they're right to have a sense of chaos because in the olden days, when the US was the undisputed world power, uh, people didn't want to mess with the US.
Mhm.
But in the past 50 years, when the US mismanaged its foreign policy, now people aren't afraid. And Israel mismanaged its foreign policy, and people are not afraid of Israel until recently. And so the Western world, the democracies, have to regain their deterrence
Mhm.
and show that they can be tough. And democracies are always split in half between people who want to win and people who want to lose. And so democracies are always fighting with one hand behind their back. Whereas the dictatorships, there's no one criticizing a dictatorship in a dictatorship because they're in prison. If they're lucky, they're in prison. If they're not lucky, they're in a cemetery. And so the dictators can operate unimpeded. The democracies fight with one hand behind their back. So the democracies better start learning fast how to fight wars, how to win wars, and without destroying their own country and without running out of money and running out of soldiers. So it's a managerial nightmare. But my key conclusion of my book is that we have to manage democracies more like corporations because
Sure.
corporations can handle this level of complexity. Democracies can't. And we have to evolve into a management capability that can meet challenges and solve challenges without endless debate upon endless debate and not making any decisions.
Absolutely. And then, but I also would add that democracies, if they're fighting other democracies, that they're on the same level. But for example, and we'll get into this a little bit later on in our podcast, but for example, Israel, a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, and we can also further discuss, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Could Israel stand to maybe not be a democracy, especially during war times? The benefits of perhaps of the UAE not being a democracy, and it would look very different right now on the world stage had it been had it been a democracy, but also that a democracy fighting a proxy or a democracy fighting a dictatorship has to have different tactics. And that's something that I think a lot of the democracies are not understanding, even currently in today's wars. So, speaking of Israel, I ask all of my guests the same question. Where were you on October 7th? And what were the ramifications of that Jewish genocide on your life?
Well, I was in Florida in the Palm Beach area when that happened. And ever since I wrote my book on the multi-front war, I was afraid that democracies were not able to handle dictatorships.
Mhm.
And so therefore, see the way, in contrast to democracies, uh, as you know, when you talk to friends or synagogue, newspapers, everyone say, "Oh, we're in peacetime." Well, the thesis of my book is that we're always in wartime. There's no such thing as peacetime.
Mhm,
And we've been in wartime ever since the beginning of human beings, whenever you think human beings began.
mhm,
And so every day is war. And Israel on October 7th forgot every day is war. It forgot the parasha that we just read about the Amalekites. Remember the Amalekites. Don't forget the Amalekites. Hamas is the Amalekites. Iran, the master of the proxies, with over 500,000 worldwide proxy terrorists around the world,
mhm.
is the modern recreation of the Amalekites from 3,400 years ago. So that's why I say some of the elements of World War III are World War One. If you want to go back to biblical times, we're in World War One. It began with the Amalekites, and Iran is just the latest recreation of that. So, I was very disappointed in Israel, like everybody was, and including Israel itself, including the leadership of Israel, that they forgot about the Amalekites. They were sleeping on October 7th. It was a double holiday of Shabbat and Simchas Torah. So it was doubly inexcusable. And everyone knows that, so I'm not telling you anything new. But I spent the last 5 years trying to help democracies um, prepare for war. Again, on the thesis, every day is a war. You have to be prepared every day. And so I was a little disappointed in myself that I wasn't more famous and more influential and more capable of helping Israel and America, in Europe, by the way. Those are the three areas that I focus on. I was disappointed I wasn't able to help them more than I helped them.
And so it seems like you were not you were obviously disappointed and furious, but you were not shocked that the genocide happened, given that you have been studying the geopolitics all along.
Well, the war with Iran began in 1979
Mhm.
when the um, Islamic Republic of Iran, as they call themselves, I just call them a terror organization, illegally took over Iran
They are, yeah. Mhm.
and promptly announced death to America and death to Israel, which sounds like genocide to me. So for 45 years, Iran has promised to kill everyone in America, namely Christian. America's 90% Christians, and everyone in Israel, and Israel's 80% Jews. So this war has been going on for 45 years. And the lesson we've all learned since Hitler days is when someone promises, some lunatic promises to do something ridiculously crazy, you have to take them at their word instead of saying they're lying or they're emotional or they don't really believe that. I believe those things. So when the lunatics, the criminal organization, or the death cult, if you want to call that, running Iran, says they want to kill all the Christians in America and all the Jews in Israel, I believe them. But our governments were not acting as if they believed that. And so our collective governments have spent 45 years watching Iran arm itself, just like our parents and grandparents did in World War II when they spent 10 years watching Germany and Japan rearm themselves and did nothing. So World War III is just a repeat of World War II. We didn't learn anything from history.
Now, would you say, so you're going back to the Ayatollahs taking over and basically making Iran making Iran a terrorist state about 40 years ago. But would you venture to say that this actually goes back to 1928 with the rise or with the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood? Because if you look at Israel, this is just my geopolitical opinion, I wanting to see if you agree or disagree. So if we look at Israel, so what a lot of Jews miss from my interactions, they think that Arabs were attacking Jews for hundreds and hundreds of years in Israel. But when we look at the records, and a lot of the academic records are now, and historians are correcting themselves, the two major massacres that took place in Sva in the 1600s and the 1800s were actually enacted by the Druze. So the Druze, they were not anti-Semitic. Obviously, they're still not anti-Semitic. They were just fighting for territories, but they were massacring Jews. And most assaults in Israel before the British occupation was Druze on Jews, which is very ironic because at one point Jews were even intermarrying with Druze until the Jews put a stop to that, not for anti-Semitic reasons. They themselves were being attacked. So then fast forward to the British occupation and all of the Arab revolts and the Arab massacres, Hebron being in 1929 being the most infamous, were all fomented by the British. The British were very anti-Semitic. We know that the mandate turned into an occupation quite quickly in 1922 when Churchill, as colonial secretary, stole 78% of the homeland. We know of the double standards that Jews were not allowed to have weapons. The Arabs, for the most part, were in few incidents. They were not, but they were not being punished like the Jews. We know what happened, of course, in 1947 with the UN partition plan, UN 181. It was not two states for two people. There already was a Transjordan, which was 78% of stolen Jewish land. So what the British were doing, the British were enacting a coup using the UN to divvy up the paltry 22% left for Jews to make a terror state within the Jewish remainder of the land. So for me, it actually goes back to the start of the Muslim Brotherhood, then the British fomenting all of those wars. And then with Hamas, right? Like Hamas, when it came to power, or actually before Hamas, let's talk about how in 1948, what did Egypt do? Egypt settled in 250,000 of its nationals in Gaza, radicalized them, and they have been quite vocal that their goal was to kill Jews. And that's what they were doing well before Hamas. We know that before Fatah, under Israeli rule, even the first Intifada, remember in 1987, was perpetrated right under Israeli rule when Gaza was under Israeli rule. So to me, this was just a blatant, negligent, traitorous, not even oversight. It was just, yeah, it was a traitorous act on the Israelis against their own people to not pay attention. Like you said, when someone's saying that they're going to kill you for 80 years, even 100 years, if we're going to go back, to the early 1920s with the British taking over, why are you not paying attention? And so what got me, so I was in Israel for Sukkot, and I had never been there for that holiday specifically. I'd been to Israel 6 other times, but never for this joyous holiday. And I remember going there right when the country was fraught with the protests. Israel was almost on the brink of civil war. I remember it was the judicial reform protests. The left was wholly against it. The people on the right obviously knew that the Supreme Court needed to be reformed because the Supreme Court in Israel is mostly on the left, sides not with Israeli interests most of the time, sadly. And so I didn't know what to expect. I even was thinking of canceling my trip. I'm like, oh my gosh, like what am I flying into? But my friends convinced me to go. I went and I was shocked. It was so peaceful that week of Sukkot. Sad to say to the audience, the past 6 trips I'd been there, there was always some terrorist attacks in Judea and Samaria, in down in the south. And it's something that unfortunately Jews have come to expect. And something else we can talk about a little bit later is when will we say enough? Right? Like, is October 7th enough? Have we learned never again is actually never again? We need to get to the point where Israel's never building another mamad, no need for another mamad. Like, look at Egypt, right? Like, Egypt doesn't build mamads, not because it doesn't care about citizens, but because it has the correct policies to protect itself against terrorism. And I can get into my trip to Egypt and Saudi Arabia that I had taken as well. But anyway, so that week in Israel was so joyous. Everyone was in the best mood. I was going from sukkah to sukkah, meeting all different kinds of Jews, like on the left, on the right, apolitical. It didn't matter. Everyone was getting along. Didn't see one protest. And I remember thinking towards the end of my trip, wow, there were no terrorist attacks this week, which was not normal, unfortunately, for Israel. And for those who might not know me, I, before October 7th, was very, very pro Arab. Like I was riding high on the Abraham Accords horse. I was so hopeful. I had been to Dubai twice. By the time I'd gone back to Israel, back end of September, I had already been to Egypt and Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Oman. And I really thought maybe some kind of peace is going to be possible. And so I came back on the 6th, on October 6th, and I remember telling my mom, I want to extend my trip. I want to stay here another week. And she said to me, why? You've already been there a week. You go back so often. You can come back again. You should come home. And I was kind of, arguing with her back and forth. What should I do? What should I do? And something told me, all right, like I should listen to my mom. I should come back. So I came back on the 6th. I wake up the morning of the 7th. My sister texts me urgently. She never texts me in the morning. And she said, turn on the news, look what's going on in Israel. And I said to her, nothing is going on in Israel. I literally just came back from there, go back to sleep. She's like, no, turn on the news. So I did. I personally was shocked. I remember it was like 22 murdered, then it was, you remember like the rising of the death toll. And I couldn't understand what was happening. Like I thought I was watching some kind of movie instead of real life because, remember it was shocking when at least, I mean, I wasn't following Israel before 20, let's say 12, but so those who were and knew about the intifadas, clearly there were a lot more death tolls. But in my recent, experience, shocking to me was like 5 killed, 7, but 22 was outrageous. And it was 50, and then it was 100. And once I reached past 250, like I just was besides myself. Like I didn't know what to do. I froze for about 2 weeks. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't function, even though I'm a Zionism educator. It was, to me, and I didn't blame Israel at first either. I was like, oh my gosh, like these terrorists, and what are they doing? And they're not even humans, and they're subhumans, and like humans don't act like that. And it took my best friend who's Israeli, and she called me, and we were talking, and she said Israel failed us, and that was the first time I heard those words. And that's when I began to analyze it more from that stance that I had just been in Egypt in 2022. And Egypt under Sisi, as you know, is very different than Egypt before anyone else. When Hamas killed 16 Egyptian soldiers in 2012, when Morsi was in charge, Morsi did not react one bit. Remember, Morsi was letting Hamas run amok in the Sinai. So Sisi comes in through a coup in 2014. The first thing he does, he bombs Rafah on the Egyptian side, destroys 1,200 tunnels. His army bombed 3,000 buildings, and then he expanded the buffer zone between Gaza and Egypt. Not only that, but he built, and actually, I believe he had America help Egypt build a steel wall. He demanded that. He said, we need that protection and you're going to provide it to us. So being on the border, so I remember visiting 2 borders, the Israeli Gaza border. We were at the Erez crossing, and I realized something. Are these people delusional? And these people, I mean, the leftist Jews, because I was sitting in the audience and the director of the border crossing was there, and he was lamenting that only 40,000 work permits, this is 2022, were being issued. Everyone was clapping, like, yeah, like we need more, we need more. So they had 2 Gazans come in through the crossing when we were there. And he said something to them in Arabic. And I remember he said, oh, they just said, this podcast is on PC, so I hope you don't mind that we're cursing here. So he said, oh, I'm very thrilled to share with you that they said, fuck Hamas. And everyone's clapping like, yay, they just said like, F Hamas. And I was the only one who was thinking, as soon as they get to Gaza, they're going to say F Israel. Like, how are we so naive about this? And then I went to Egypt First of all, for those who have not been to Egypt since 2014, there are checkpoints everywhere. First of all, there's a checkpoint from Alexandria to Cairo. Within Cairo, there are quite a few checkpoints. You go down south. I remember in one day, I had gone through 10 checkpoints in total. It's annoying, but it's necessary. And people don't mind, not only because it's a dictatorship, but Sisi finally rid Egypt of terrorists. And you know what he did, right? He had most of the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists killed off. Others are sitting in actual jails, like real jails. They're being tortured. And so it's a real deterrent. And so remember being at the border of Egypt and Gaza. First of all, they have a standing army there. They have snipers up on these walls. No one is no one is issuing work permits to Gazans who most of them are Egyptians, are former Egyptians. Those are their fellow countrymen. Not one Egyptian is thinking, I want to help the Gazans. Not one of them is driving or even thinking to drive Gazans to Egyptian hospitals because at the time before the war, they knew that Gaza had 36 hospitals. Why the hell are we giving them any aid? They have aid from Qatar, they have aid from Turkey and the EU and the liberals of the US. Why do they need our help for? But meanwhile, we have Jews in Israel on the left who are wanting more work permits, who are feeling bad for Gazans, who did not understand their enemies. And the Egyptians did. And the Egyptians are mostly Muslims, right? But they understood, okay, we don't want terrorism here. This is a hotbed of terrorism. We're going to separate ourselves. So all Israel had to do was copy and paste Egyptians' policy against Gaza, and the genocide would not have happened. That was my speculation from what I had seen on the ground in Egypt and also in Jordan. Go to Jordan, there are checkpoints everywhere. You go to Saudi Arabia, there are checkpoints and surveillance cameras everywhere. You go to Dubai, of course, it's very safe there, and they keep a tight lid on their citizens. So Israel could have done, like you said, so much because they knew, they knew that this entity, many entities, right behind it, like the Iran and Hamas and even the Palestinian Authority, they're not moderates. They're terrorists in suits. No difference. All of them have been saying for decades and decades, we're going to murder you. And they did, right? Like I think in the Second Intifada that lasted from 2000 to 2005, 1,200 Israeli civilians were murdered. Was that not enough of a wake-up call to enact policies against occupiers of our land? It was a complete shift for me back in October. So what I wanted to focus with you on is the topic, and this could be controversial because I've had pushback on this: Islam itself or political Islam. And I bring this up because when I was pro-Arab, and I know that not all Arabs hate Jews, they're 1.6, or not all Muslims hate Jews, they're 1.6 billion Muslims. If all of them truly, truly despise us, we wouldn't be around at this point. But I mean, for the majority, and we see, right, all the Hamas protests worldwide, different governments that are supporting this terrorism as well. And when I started my op-ed writing career back in 2019, each and every editor made sure to say Islamists or political Islam. I could not say Islam itself. So what is your take? Is it Islam that is at the center of this, or political Islam? And what is political Islam, and why do people differentiate that?
Well, Islam is both a religion and a political movement.
Mm-hmm.
Religions are protected by the American Constitution and in all Western countries, but political movements are not protected. There's no guaranteed protection for political movement. Mm-hmm. So I heard a Muslim expert, or he said he was an expert, speak 5 years or so ago. He said that 50% of the Quran is orders by Muslims against infidels.
Mm-hmm.
And only 50% of the Quran is orders to Muslims about what Muslims are supposed to do. So you using that as a guide, you could say that um, political Islam is the 50% of Muslim directions in the Quran against infidels. And so now the question is, how do you separate Islam as a religion from Islam as a political movement?
Right.
And then how do you criminalize Islam as a political movement? And then how do you defeat them?
Mm-hmm.
Well, no Western countries figured out how to do that. And so therefore, the Western countries do not deport or jail Islamists or political Islam adherents or jihadists until they do something of a physical nature.
Mm-hmm.
So if they blow something up or if they hurt somebody, then theoretically the police get involved. But the police do not get involved with what I call cultural terrorism. Mm-hmm. So if someone says, I believe in Sharia law, I think we should impose Sharia law on Christians and Jews and Hindus. And no one puts that person in jail. I call that cultural terrorism. So there's physical terrorism and cultural terrorism. We somewhat know how to deal with physical terrorism. We have no clue how to deal with cultural terrorism. And that's why the immigration is growing into America or into all Western countries. And there's more mosques and there's more schools and there's more demand for consideration of Muslim holidays or other events. And we're all being invaded. And you see, Muslims who believe in Islam as religion and Muslims who believe in Islam as a political movement do not wear baseball jerseys.
Right. That would be helpful.
It would be helpful.
Right.
They do not wear uniforms. So we have no clue how to differentiate the two from each other until we get ourselves into a war. And then then we have to do what Israel's doing. Basically, the Islamists in Gaza are the 40,000 Hamas terrorists and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists, and Israel's got to go hunt each of them down one by one or en masse, and they all have to be eliminated. They all have to be arrested or killed. They can surrender anytime they want. And they do not wear uniforms, but they carry guns. So basically, anyone who carries a gun, Israel has to arrest in Gaza. But bear something in mind, a 23-year-old terrorist with a gun went to school for almost 20 years and learned this false narrative that Muslims have to kill all Jews, Christians, and Hindus. And so the Hamas war began 20 years earlier, but Israelis ignored that, ignored the schools, ignored the miseducation, ignored the assignment until the massacre took place and then reacted. And that was a big mistake. Israel should have reacted much sooner.
Absolutely. So the most popular children's game in Gaza before the war, and I'm sure it's even more popular now during the war as Gaza is being bombed ferociously, was called Stab a Jew. So these like the audience should see these videos on Instagram. Like literally these little kids, girls and boys alike, did not discriminate against either gender, would have a friend play the part of a Jew and go stab, 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 Yehud, 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 which is Arabic for Jew. And so no wonder, right? So Israel is one of the very few countries, if not the only country in the world, that has 12-year-olds sitting in prisons. And then you have these anti-Semitic NGOs crying about child abuse and they don't even call them prisoners. You can help me. What do they call them? Remember when Israel released the 240 terrorists, they called them prisoners of humanity, something that the liberal NGOs were calling them.
Yeah, they always invent names to
Exactly, like just
cause
excuse.
people to not understand what's going on.
Right, and to soften what's going on. And so, but those child teen terrorists were attacking IDF soldiers, and even like I hear reports, and I have friends who are serving the IDF, or who already did their tours in Gaza, and without divulging obviously sensitive information, they were saying like, of course, we're going after terrorists, we're not going after civilians, but a lot of times you can't tell who's who because you see a child and you're going over to help a child, and the child is throwing an RPG at you. So what are you going to do? Right? Just like not do anything with this child. Or women are also being used by Hamas. And by the way, willingly, that they're not being forced to, they want to. We all hear of the stories of the hostages that were released when they were dragged into Gaza. The women and children were cheering the entire time. Or that Bedouin that was released or rescued, not released, rescued recently. He was saying that when he was taken to the one of the hospitals, I think it was like Shifra Hospital, the infamous one that Israel was being blamed for bombing, for civilians. Obviously, it was all terrorists there. So he was saying the nurses and the doctors, these civilians, were cheering that these terrorists brought in the Jewish pride. Like they didn't know that this man was Bedouin. And so it's a society. So that's the thing. So when people say like, oh, we need to like, go only after the terrorists, Hamas is never going to die in reality. They can be beat militarily, but then Hamas came from where? They came from within the Arab occupier population. So as long as the population is there, 2.2 million, a little bit less now, there's always going to be the next Hamas, the next Hamas. So the only thing Israel can do, if it doesn't want to eliminate that population, which it should have done with the proper siege, and that's what Gallant had advised Bibi to actually get our hostages back, because even terrorists get hungry and they don't want to be starved to death. So because he failed to do that, you can kill anyone you want. They have next in kin, all of them. Like how many of them dream of being martyrs? Like their goal is to die killing a Jew. And it's not just in Gaza, it's also unfortunately in Judea and Samaria. Like we see it now with Jenin has always been a terrorist hotbed since the Oslo Accords. There was just a tunnel that was found in Judea, a tunnel that we thought was only specialized to Gaza, and they found tunnels in on the border of Israel and Lebanon. So these subhumans are tunneling all over Israel. And so Israel needs to think, like you said, long term, not just short term. So short term, fine. We need to avenge the death of these Jews. So, like, whoever enacted this genocide, they're the leaders, at least, like they need to be eliminated. Fine. That's step one. What's going to happen 10 years from now, especially with Netanyahu announcing that he does not want to, that Israel's not reclaiming Gaza, that there needs to be moderate Arab leadership. Who? The PA that just literally announced that they joined forces with Hamas, and they've been paying Hamas terrorists for years, and they have been supporting Hamas. And by the way, how many of they found the Palestinian Authority terrorists joined with Hamas and the 2,200 civilians from Gaza to help murder Jews on October 7th? So that's where I think Israel is very naive, along with the US, in terms of the depraved capabilities of our enemies. We're not fighting nations, we're fighting those who think fundamentally different from us, whose goal is to kill. It's not to work in peace or to find solutions. And that's why I always say it's not a conflict, because conflicts, for me, a conflict is you're having a border dispute with Canada, right? Like it's something that's very easily solved, or you're dealing with two parties of the same morality. So whenever people say like, oh, it's a conflict between Israel and Gaza or Israel and Palestine, which is anti-Semitic in and of itself, obviously Palestine was the colonizer term for Israel for 1,812 years. It's equating Jews with the terrorists. So I think what you focus on is naming the enemy, and for me it's naming the terminology. Let's call it what it is. It's a war on Jews, and how do we win this war when your combatants are the entire population in Gaza, are the entire almost the entire population areas A and B in Judea and Samaria, right? And there's the fifth column inside of Israel also. So that's the thinking. So something else that you said that was I learned, like this is why I love having these podcasts. I always learn something new from each and every guest. So you had said that 50% of the Quran is political, and then 50% deals more with the religious side. So is it fair to say that is why every ex-jihadist that is pro-Israel now, from Ayan Hirsi Ali to Imam Tawhidi, many, many more, or even Mossab Youssef. He, was part of the Hamas royal family, and then he was working with Israel. Those who have not seen the film The Green Prince, highly recommend. I was at a FIDF fundraiser, and he said that it's not political, his words, not mine. He said it's not political Islam, it's all of Islam. He said that, like you mentioned, that Islam names all non-Muslims kafirs, non-believers, but it's only Jews who are specifically named in the Quran as the enemies. So I did not know that. And so what you said made me realize, like, wait, so everyone who has seen the light, who now supports Israel, does not support terror anymore, they all left Islam. All of them are ex-Muslims now. So I found that to be quite interesting, except I think the only exception, the gentleman, Noor Dari, I believe his name is, he's Pakistani. So he is very, very pro-Israel. He's very religious. He still prays 5 times a day. So I wonder um, how does he align being pro-Israel with what he's reading in the Quran and the imams that he goes to. So that's something to dissect a little bit.
Well, he could be internalizing the 50% of the Quran that focuses on relationships between Muslims and each other, as opposed to the infidels outside.
So he chooses to ignore the political side.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. But yeah, like, I just found it really interesting. Like every time I see a post about someone who's an ex-Muslim, they always point out that these, well, I guess not so secrets, hadiths about all the kafirs and what Muslims are sanctioned to do to them or against them. So more and more is coming out with those who are leaving the religion. But at the same point, and this was more from when I was very pro-Arab, not necessarily that I was pro-Muslim, because I know there are many Arabs that are Christian, of course. But when I was much more pro-Arab, I was obsessed with finding out more about the golden age of Islam. So I guess my questioning point is, when I was reading about that, okay, so we know about obviously Muslim terror attacks and how Jews are named in the Quran as enemies. We know what happened to the Jewish clans, or some of the Jewish clans that were targeted by Muhammad's army. What would explain the golden age of Islam? So was it that golden, number one? And number two, what was that couple 100-year reprieve, or so we think, from within the Muslim society towards Jews?
Well, I don't know if I believe in the golden age. Muslims have been at war with Jews and Christians and Hindus for 1,400 years, since roughly the year 630, when Muhammad and his followers basically declared war on civilization, declared war on all Jews, Christians, and Hindus, and took over almost half of the known world at that time. When they broke out of what we now call Saudi Arabia and then illegally invaded 50 roughly 55 other countries, mostly Christian countries. So I don't know if there was such a thing as the Golden Age, because according to Islam, everybody is always a second class or third class within. So Jews would have had to pay the special tax for Jews or for infidels.
The jizya,
They
the jizya
the
tax.
jizya, right, and they would have to walk behind Muslims, and they're if they were a witness that didn't count in the
Sure.
court. So I'm not a big fan of Golden Age. The only thing that could have been golden is they weren't killing all the Jews they could find,
Right.
and they let Jews exist. So if you want to call that a golden age, I guess you could. And sometimes I hear stories early in the Ottoman Empire when you could have a benevolent dictator
Mhm.
who says that I want the Jews here. I want commerce. I want more free thought. But it never ends well. Then some other bad guy takes over and changes his mind.
That's so true because I'm such a student of history, especially given what I do. And so even when I launched the website, I had to dig through the facts. And I immediately thought 10 years ago that, oh, all the Muslim rulers of all the Muslim occupiers of Israel were horrific. Maybe it was the Christians that were better. And I found it to be the opposite, right? The Crusaders near decimated the Jewish population in Israel. The British occupiers did a lot of damage, the ramifications of which we still see today. But then I think of a ruler like Saladin the First of the Ayyubid dynasty. He was very benevolent to Jews in Israel, and he invited Jews back into Jerusalem. And then there was another ruler, the name escapes me at the moment, who had asked Jews to rebuild Tiberias, which had been decimated as well by the Mamluks and then the Ottomans, right? The first half of the 400-year rule, the Ottomans, let Jews live. I mean, of course, they had to pay taxes, but they let them live according to their cultural norms and faiths in Israel. And it was the second half. And so the more digging I did through the historical realm, I realized it was actually the Christians in under the Ottoman rule who were jealous of Jews the first 200 years of Ottoman rule because the Jews were favored. They were, a lot of them were in court positions, under the court, and the Christians were being subjugated. And so, finally, when there was an economic downturn, as happens throughout history against our people, it was the Christians under Ottoman rule that decided to turn against Jews. And like you said, with a different ruler, that Ottoman ruler decided to side with the Christians and then started to go after Jews. Like, of course, they weren't being persecuted, but their communities were a lot more underdeveloped. They were not treated with respect, and they were not seen as useful as they were the first 200 years when they still had those ties to Sepharad. But then again, we have to remember that it was the Ottomans that saved a lot of Jews from the Inquisition, those boats coming in. And then they only not only saved Jews in Spain, but also from France during their Inquisition. So when I'm in the Golden Age, again, like this is what I'm reading, and maybe we have to look at it through a different lens. There was a lot of academic collaboration in the study of the sciences, and medicine was one of them. Even language, a lot of words were being borrowed between Hebrew and Arabic, and I believe I had read that even correspondence to the Jews in Iraq were being facilitated also by some of the Muslims. So, but you're right, at the same time, Jews were still dhimmis, as were Christians. So it's not like Jews were ever seen as equal to Muslims, but it was just, you're right, like it was an absence of the war on Jews. So maybe we need a different moniker for that era.
Right. Now, bear in mind, though, for their 1400-year history of illegal occupation, the Muslims, by the way, all the Muslims in the world should be in Saudi Arabia right now.
Mm-hmm.
Every country outside of Saudi Arabia, they illegally invaded.
Of
So
course.
during their illegal invasion of 55 or so countries, they attacked the Jews, they attacked the Christians, they attacked the Hindus. The only reason they stopped doing it is the Hindus started killing them, and the Jews started protecting themselves, and the Christians started protecting themselves at the gates of Vienna and in Spain. So the only reason the Islamists
Mm-hmm.
did not take over the world is because the Christians, Jews, and Hindus said, "We've had enough, and we're going to defend ourselves," and that's where we are today. So the Jews are willing to defend themselves. The Hindus are willing to defend themselves. The question, really, that has to be answered is: will Christians protect themselves? Right
Right.
now, there's no evidence that Christians want to protect themselves. And it's very disturbing because there's roughly 2 billion Christians and 16 million Jews. And I look at Jews and Christians as Siamese twins, that we're part of Judeo-Christian culture, philosophy, religion, respect for the rule of law. And so if the Christians fall into demise, then the little 16 million Jews are all on their own. And so I'm not, fortunately, the billion two Hindus are strong, and they're not going to sit back and get killed by the Muslims. And also, the Abraham Accord countries, Muslims, they don't want to get killed by the Islamists any more than the Jews, Christians, and Hindus do.
They
So it
were
could,
thrilled to have their terrorists now living in Europe.
right. So it
Yeah.
could be that the Christians in Eastern Europe, plus the Jews, and half of whom live in Israel, and the other half obviously elsewhere, plus the Hindus, plus the Sunni Muslims who want to survive, uh, basically work together in a mutual security arrangement. You can call it different names, whether it's
Mhm.
Abraham Accords or a reimagined NATO, and then save themselves from the Christian countries that get invaded by the Muslims and then get taken over by the Muslims, and that'll be the nucleus of the free world. It won't be 3.5 billion people like it used to be in the free world. It may be maybe 2 billion.
Mhm.
It could be that 1.5 billion Christians basically get taken over by Muslims and stop being Christians. So half of Christianity is at risk right now, and they have no clue what's going on. At least Jews and Hindus know what they have to do. But by the way, the only time the Israelis knew what to do was after October 7th. They didn't. They didn't understand it before.
I mean,
And,
we can also argue that are they actually knowing what to do still? Because having a war is one thing, but is the war going to be successful? And and
the
and I would characterize success as preventing the next Jewish genocide, which is currently being planned.
well, the you have to look in pieces. Iran has roughly 500,000 worldwide terrorists. Um, Israel doesn't have to kill all of them, but it's certainly has to kill or arrest the 40,000 Gaza. America and Israel have to destroy, I'd say, 25% of the 50,000 Houthi terrorists in Yemen. And of the 75,000 terrorists in Lebanon, I'd say a third of them have to be arrested or eliminated. And then the ultimate one is who's going to blow up Iran's nuclear sites.
Right. I
And,
mean,
and
would you say that Israel and America both missed an opportunity, even several years ago, not to work with the Green Movement of Iran to help topple their regime?
well, the Obama administration was supporting Iran.
Right, but I'm not even Trump. I'm a huge Trump supporter. I could, I could not be more. But I think that Trump, one of his very, very, very few mistakes was not capitalizing on the green movement. And same thing with Israel. Like I blame both equally. When the protests were ramping up and they were begging America, even Israel, because we know that the protesters in Iran are very pro-Israel, pro-West. That would have been a golden opportunity to provide them at the very least with money and weapons so then they could help topple the regime, or covertly, since we know the Mossad is well entrenched within Iran. I don't know if American agents are or not. That could have been a very opportune partnership. And then who knows, maybe by now the Ayatollahs would have not been in power anymore.
Yeah, I remember some reporter asked Trump about regime change in Iran about 5 years ago, and Trump said, I'm not a big fan of regime change. We're not good at it. It's not our job. And I'm not going to get involved. That was a huge strategic error. By the way,
Yeah,
Trump himself was the victim of regime change
right.
organized by China. So here's Trump, as wonderful as he is, has the same problem of all Western leaders, including Israel before October 7th, is they estimate, they underestimate evil.
Right. Or that's the thing. Like I absolutely agree with you 100%. We have to arrest all the terrorists, but that's the thing. That's step one. But step two, we know that all the terrorists, they're easily replenished. Like for example, Israel killed what was his name? Hania, right, inside Tehran, which was very brave. And I don't know how they got those two ICRG agents to help them. I don't know how much money was being transferred over or why those agents even wanted to flip, but they did. Guess what? They now have a new leader, right? Which is Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar, Israel can kill him all he wants. He has a brother. I actually just wrote about it in my newsletter last night that goes out free to subscribers of TVTN. And so there's Mohammed Sinwar, who's even more ruthless than Yahya, and he was targeted more than any other terrorist by the IDF for decades. He had his house demolished several times. So that's the thing. It's like you kill one, and that's why these are like multiplying rats. It's like you kill one, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one. So that's why policies, in my opinion, matter so much more. So like again, if Israel had closed the border to Gaza. Another thing, the border opening, I was at the border, I was shocked. They said that our border is open all year round. In Egypt, their border was closed 11 months out of the year, except for Ramadan. That was the only month that their border was open because they knew who they were dealing with. So fine, if Israel doesn't have the stomach to eliminate the Arab occupier population inside Gaza, by the way, I think we should mention if Jews killed 1,200 Arabs, Muslims inside their own country, I guarantee you we all would be rounded up and put in extermination camps. But we tolerate, like, we say like, okay, well, we're gonna evacuate the population, we're gonna feed our enemy, and then we're gonna bomb empty buildings, and then we're going to like kill some terrorists who again want to be killed, and then within the population, they're going to remultiply and emerge stronger. So it's like for me, just I'm so strong in the policies. And like you mentioned, right? Like, what are we going to do? Fine, like you can be Hamas militarily, even though they don't care because they know that they're banking on the policies. They're banking on they were cheering probably for what Netanyahu said to the U.S. Congress when he said we're not going to reclaim Gaza. It's not our priority. They were probably in their bunkers, just like, yes, we are fans of Bibi right now because they know that the international community, the liberals who are anti-Semitic, are going to sweep in. They're going to install their little puppets, and that's it. They're going to think about it: Turkey, Qatar, Kuwait, the EU, the liberals of the US. I mean, there's a whole there's a whole line of them waiting eagerly to refund and rebuild a much stronger Hamas. They're not going to call it Hamas. It's going to be another name, right? Like in Judea and Samaria, Hamas is called the PA. Literally no difference. In the PA, why are we not deporting those Arabs? Most of them came from Jordan. Deport them back to Jordan. The 30, 40% that are genetic Jews who were converted under Egyptian caliph in the 11th century, Israel knows which clans are genetic Jews. So fine, they have equity in the land, they can stay, and maybe they can stay on probation, right? Like make sure that there is no terroristic activities for 5, 10 years, then you're allowed to vote. Over on the border of Lebanon, Ehud Barak, what did he do in, I believe it was 2000, right? He gave back, or he had Israel withdraw from that security zone. And it's unclear. And now Lebanon is in violation of UN SR 1701. So legally, Israel has every right to reoccupy and annex actually that border with Lebanon. Why is it not doing that? So we're playing tit for tat with these Hezbollah rats, these subhumans. They don't care. They love it. It's great PR for them. And meanwhile, their population in Lebanon is suffering needlessly. Like I actually feel bad for a lot of the Lebanese. They didn't ask for this war. So it was the Christians in that country who were weak, who led in all of the Arab occupiers. Remember, they led in at first like 100,000 of them. And then they asked Israel for help against those same occupiers. Israel did the heavy lifting in 1982. The Christian forces didn't want to do anything. And then towards the end, the Christian forces, I think it was the SLA, the Southern Lebanese Army, they were the ones who massacred some Arab encampments, refugee camps, and then Israel got blamed for it. So all these Lebanese who hate Israel, it's because of weak leadership. So I think it's high time for Israel to fine. You have your military battles. You need that for you need that for resolve to the population, like we're avenging the blood, but then what? It's the next 5, 10 years. And again, look what's happening in Judea and Samaria. Even now, there are terrorist attacks happening every day. There is no rhyme or reason for Jews right now to be dying from terrorist attacks when we have active military and we're trying to show the world never again when we're not like not one Jew. Like, so that's the thing. I really believe that Israel should strike so hard. They had the chance militarily to strike so hard. It did not. And I have nothing against the IDF. The IDF to me is one of the bravest, strongest armies in the world. It's being underutilized by the powers that be. But then it's the leadership in Israel that needs to stay up. Like I have friends in Israel who none of them voted for Netanyahu, and they're all on the right. All of them voted for Ben Gavir, and now there's this rising star, Amichai Shikli, who is not afraid to say what's needed. He said, "What we need to do in Gaza, what we need to do in Judea and Samaria, if we're going to prevent future genocides." So when are we, as a people, going to wake up? But the Hindus, you mentioned Hindus, so I have Hindu friends, and they have the same criticism against the Indian government as we do against the Israeli government. They said there are two people in the world who have self-hating people. Jews are one of them. We have a portion of our population that are self-hating Jews, sadly. And the Hindus in India who are on the left, my friends say that they want to be subjugated, right? Like you have the Muslim waqfs that are taking over land left and right. There's a Hindu genocide right now going on in Bangladesh. The Indian government's not helping. It's not helping its own people. So that's the thing. It's having that sense of duty. And the Christians too. Like I think blaming all Christians could be a little bit unfair. This is just my opinion because the they don't see, and this is awful, but in my opinion, the Christians in Europe don't see the Arab Christians as part of their community for the most part, nor are they helping themselves. Like we see Europe being overrun by these invaders. So they themselves are have fallen. Like, I mean, maybe you have a different opinion, but to me, they're parts of Western Europe, like France, that has absolutely fallen, parts of the UK. And so they don't think that it has fallen, at least a portion of the population. So to go into these sovereign countries like Egypt, parts of or Nigeria and other parts of Africa, Coptic Christians are being persecuted in Egypt. There are Christian massacres going on in Nigeria and many other nations. There's a lack of urgency there.
Well, it goes back to the issue that I mentioned, that Christians aren't
Yeah.
willing to defend themselves. Now, we need a very strong America.
Right.
Now, first, America has to decide to save itself. The Christians have to decide to save themselves. And then we have to go save Europe. So if America, under new leadership, gets its act together, we're going to have to go to France and England, using two examples,
Right.
and say to the leadership of those countries, you are not protecting the 90% of the people who are Christian.
Right.
You're massive human rights violators. We're going to set up tribunals and start investigating the leaders of France and England for systemic abuse of Christians. I'm using that as an example to scare them. And we may have to threaten to cut our diplomatic ties. We might have to threaten to reduce trade and investment in those countries. But we have no moral authority right now. So we're not saving ourselves.
No one's
So
scared of us
right,
under Joe, right?
right.
But
So we can't possibly.
They were scared under Trump.
Yeah, right.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So hopefully we get our act together, and then we can start moralizing to England and France that they have to protect their Christian population. And now, if the United Nations weren't a criminal organization itself,
Mm-hmm.
we should bring them to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. But those are kangaroo courts run by the Islamists. So it makes no sense to do that.
Although, do we have any recourse of kicking the UN out of America? And I know because I live in New York City, so I understand that they consider the land that the UN headquarters is on as international land. So it's not, they don't consider it American land. But does America have any recourse in kicking them out at all?
Well, first, we never should have signed on to the United Nations in 1946. But having made that mistake, now the question is what to do about it.
Was it a what was it a different, because I know like what the UN did to Israel, but I don't know all around. So if you can shed some light on that, was it a very different UN that we should not have signed on, or were we so desperate for peace after World War II that we thought we had no other choice?
Yes, what you said, the latter. But bear in mind, the UN gives China and Russia vetoes over American national security. Well, when I read the Constitution, it doesn't say the president's commander in chief, and then there's an asterisk, and then you look at the bottom of the page, it's subject to the desires of Russia and China. So the UN is an illegal organization taking away sovereignty from America. We didn't vote for them. We vote for presidents. We don't vote for the UN.
So you're saying that America did not read the fine print?
I think they purposely didn't read the fine print. It was a communist, it was a Russian communist idea, and their communist agents in the government in 1946 convinced the American public of all the nice, wonderful things the UN could do. They've been bamboozled the political leaders into signing on to the UN. So never should have, it's an infringement on our sovereignty, never should have allowed it to happen.
And now we're what, just stuck with it or nothing?
Well, we supply almost 25% of its revenue. We should start using our power. The president, Gutierrez, hates Jews and Christians. He's entirely inappropriate to be there. We should announce that he's fired, and we want him out of his office before the day is over.
And so President Trump, when he was in office, didn't he threaten to, or at least he was entertaining the idea of America leaving the UN? And I think at one point Israel entertained that idea for themselves. And then I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but Japan even said, okay, well, if America and Israel leave, we might join in the departure at the UN. Is that something that is even realistic?
Well, I always have an expression, in a perfect world versus the world that we live. In a perfect world, yes, all of that would happen. But we don't live in a perfect world. And of the 193 countries, 2/3 of them are criminal organizations. So if the 1/3 of the countries that are not criminal organizations leave, then the UN will be 100% criminal organizations.
So
And,
what it,
and
right,
that,
so would it even make a difference? So like if we leave, we're actually harming the world. Is that what you're saying?
no, we'd be saving the world, but then China and Russia will use
But-
the UN
Mhm.
and say we need human rights investigations of the leadership of America and the other third of the countries that are not yet criminal organizations.
So we're the only bulwark that, or us and the few. So like it or
Right.
not, we're stuck with them, and we need to just work the best we can to thwart even worse plans that
And we have to throw our money around.
Mhm.
We have to say the World Health Organization is run by China, and they
Yeah,
killed 1 million Americans with COVID. We're going to
absolutely.
have to. We're going to find the leadership of the World Health Organization, put them on trial in America.
Yeah.
Okay, but we don't act like we want to win. We act like pussycats. And when you're dealing with criminal organizations, you can't act like pussycats.
Absolutely. So hopefully, I mean, looking at internal polling, hopefully Trump has a very good chance. It's not that Trump can't win this election. I mean, I personally have evidence that we won in 2020. Obviously, there was a lot of
There's
cheating going
there's a
on.
100% chance Trump
Mhm.
won last
Yeah.
time.
Mhm.
100.000% chance.
Did you see the film 2000 Mules?
Is that, and by the way, he won for a whole variety of reasons, but that never shows up in the newspapers.
Right.
People,
And then we're being called crazies because we know with given evidence that that election was stolen, and that's it. Like everything's a cover up. So that's the thing. It's how far the Dems are going to cheat this election, and that's why we need to. It's the same thing in 2016. The only reason that Trump was able to actually win the election, well, he won on merit, but the only reason the election was not stolen was because he won by such a large margin. That he
yes,
did not win by such a large margin in 2020. I'll tell you off record some interesting voting facts from the Rust Belt states, even amongst Republicans, that may have contributed to that factor. But now I think most Americans have seen the light, and I think the election's going to come down. I also work in politics. This is what I tell people. I said the people who love what's going on in America, they're going to be voting for Kamala, and I call her Hamas Harris. The people who are just incensed with what's going on today, the economy and the border and the wars and safety. I mean, I live in New York City. Crime is through the roof. They're going to be voting for Trump. So it's a very binary choice that could not have been more clear. So it just that's the thing. Like, how far are they going to be willing to cheat? Is there going to be an October surprise? What's in store? But that's the thing. I think if Trump is going to come back, he will not be having traitors in his administration like he did in the first round, and he'll know what to do. I mean, he already has those relationships with the international community. A good number of them are fearful of him. Some want to work with him, and hopefully something can be done with the UN. Hopefully, to throw our weight around finally.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. Uh,
So, um, so
Go
just
ahead.
to, oh, sorry. So you mentioned a lot about Europe. So can we go back and analyze what the hell happened with Europe? Because when I was growing, like I'm going to date myself. I'm 40. I'm 41, almost 42. So when I was growing up, Europe was fairly strong in its values. And now what's going on? I just see socialism everywhere. The Pope is socialist. So if you have any insight, for example, what happened to the Catholic Church and why is there a socialist Pope?
Well, now you're getting into another element of the
Mhm.
war, and this is what I call cultural warfare. You know, we always, when we talk about wars, we always talk about physical war, bullets and
Mhm.
bombs and things like that.
Right.
But cultural war is every bit as important as physical war. And cultural war begins at the age of 5,
Hmm.
when the young student goes to kindergarten, goes to first grade, and comes under the control of the teachers' unions, who are inevitably controlled by the communists.
Hmm.
So the and this is the same problem that Israel has with its relations with its Arab neighbors. Once the kids go to kindergarten and they are controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood thought
Mhm.
process, and
Right.
they're told to hate, Jews, Christians, and Hindus. The war becomes inevitable because when the 5-year-old becomes 20 years old and someone hands him a gun, he's going to shoot it.
Right.
And so we, the West, have not understand cultural warfare. You cannot allow Christian schools to be taken over by communists. You cannot allow Muslim schools to be taken over by Islamists.
Mm-hmm.
And what Israel didn't understand, or what America didn't understand, is you cannot allow autonomy to Islamists or communists because they will use that base to come and attack you. So we have to regain control over our schools, just as Israel has to help regain control over Arab schools. Now, by the way, within Israel, there's 8 million Jews and 2 million Arabs. The 2 million Arabs go to Israeli schools.
But they go to Arab schools, though.
Yeah, but it's the Israeli Arab curriculum.
Right, right.
So
it's not the Muslim Brotherhood at all.
That's right.
Yeah. It's not teaching them.
Right.
Yeah.
So Israel is in control of the education of the 2 million Arabs. It should be in better control. They could do a better job, but at least they're in control. Meanwhile, their secular schools, Israeli secular schools, are taken over by the communists, who are now protesting on Kaplan Street against the pretend tyrant of Netanyahu. So Israel lost control over its secular schools. That's half of the kids. The religious schools do a good job, and the Arab schools do an adequate job. So Israel has to regain control over its secular schools. America has to regain control over the 90% of the people who are Christians. And this is all cultural war. And the West is failing at cultural warfare. We have a lot of bullets and guns and soldiers. So we're good at physical war. Let's say an A, if I were giving out grades, but we deserve an F in terms of preserving the culture and fighting cultural wars, starting with the 5-year-olds.
Or even an F minus, one could venture to say. But then, okay, so for Europe, so how did they go from, again, like from what I remember when I was a child, Christian values, no transgenderism, I mean, I guess like from now that I think about it a little bit more, was just the turn to atheism, because now a lot of those countries are more atheistic than they are religious and they identify with Christianity? Or was it something within the Christian, and I know not all Christians are the same, there's Catholic and there's Protestant dominating Europe, or was it something within those entities that changed? But then you look at Eastern Europe, like I was in the Balkans recently, they're very strong in their traditions and very faith oriented. So is it the faith that's keeping Eastern Europe and the Balkans together versus the more atheist in Western Europe, or is it something else completely?
You're getting close, but I'm going to give you some terminology that'll help you. When I watched the Republican convention, not this time, but the one 4 years before that, it was done by Zoom because of COVID. Right. And they had an impassioned Black pastor who said, and the only speech I remember of the 30 speeches that I listened to, and he goes like this, my mama told me. And he goes like this, when you take God out of society, the devil marches in.
I like that. That's true. Yeah.
And I listened to that and I said, yes, his mama is very smart. I'd love to meet her someday. And so in 1962, our Supreme Court said that you can't have a school prayer anymore because we have to separate church and state, and you can't have prayers in the public schools.
Okay.
But the court never said, okay, we're going to take God out, but we're not allowing communism in, and we're not allowing Islamism in, and we're not allowing globalism. Those are the three big false narratives of the day. Collectively, I call them paganism.
So they left the gap open.
Yes. So we unilaterally disarmed intellectually away from Judeo-Christian God, and the pagans marched right in.
Is that what's happening in Europe right now also?
Yes. Yes, it's what's happening in Europe. And so if you look at the, going back to biblical times, every section, every week, every parasha
Mm.
is God versus the pagans. What's going on right now is the same. Here we are 3,400 years later, and every week goes by, it's another battle between God and the pagans. And so the pagans, which I call the communists, the Islamists, and the globalists, are taking over American society, and they're taking over Western Europe. But Eastern Europe is not playing along with that game. In the Republican states, roughly half of the states are Republican.
Right.
They're protecting themselves. So, but paganism is taking over, I'd say, roughly half of Christianity.
Is there
So
any hope for, let's say, Western Europe at this point?
there's hope if they elect me as prime minister, but I live in Florida. So
Right.
it's unlikely that the people in England or France would vote for me as prime minister, since they don't know I exist. But they need Winston Churchill. They need Margaret Thatcher. They need Ronald Reagan. They need Donald Trump. They need someone like that to say, I'm going to reclaim our society. We're a Christian society, and we're going to stay a Christian society. And I'm going to protect the kindergarten kids. I'm going to throw the communists, Islamists, and globalists out of our school system and reclaim it. And we're going to fix the immigration problem. No new immigrants. We're deporting people who hate us. And it can be done, but you need a very, very strong leader to do that. Again, since we're not doing it, we have no right to tell Europe how to do these things when we're not doing them ourselves. So hopefully, my big hope is that Trump comes in and fixes America. Israel fixes its enemies, and in particular Iran, with American help. And then the world will be safe again, as it was after World War II, after we defeated the pagans, the Nazi pagans in Germany, and the Japanese pagans in the Far East. And we set the stage for decades and decades of world peace. The seeds are there now for America to reclaim its wonderful heritage. In other words, Christians saving themselves. In Israel, the Jews save themselves, and then go on the offensive, not the physical offensive, the cultural offensive, to help Christians around the world save themselves from the pagans.
Hopefully, it's not going to take as long as it took how many years to take 800 years, 700 years for the Reconquista War, right? That was over 700 years. And in a way, I mean, I can understand why Jews helped the Moors because there was not a lot of people know that we think of the Inquisition as happening at the end of the 15th century. There was a first Inquisition, that was the Second Inquisition. The first Inquisition was happening between the 4th and 6th century in Sepharad, and the Jews living there were completely helpless. And they didn't want to live being persecuted anymore. So they actually invited, fun fact, they invited the Moors to attack Sepharad. And so the Moors, who they obviously were not original Muslims, that they also were invaded by Islam, but the Moors, I think what made them different, they had a very close, because they were Berbers. I know it's not a term that they like to use, the Amazighs. They had a very close relationship with the Jews who were already living within their communities. You know, Jews were already spread throughout North Africa well before any Arab invaders came. So the Moors, what they were doing, they would conquer towns all over Sepharad and then give over administrative rule to the Jews. So the Jews actually, there was a Jewish general that helped the Moors invade Sepharad. So, like any Muslims, though, the first couple hundred years, there was great cooperation, and then the Moors turned on the Jews. So that's the thing. You know, we still need to understand that even when we're working with Muslims, who knows where things are going to go with the Abraham Accords. We have to be careful that our own interests are not being compromised.
By the way, Jews turn on the Jews. Two
Oh, yeah.
thirds of Jews in America I call anti Semites, and one third of Jews in Israel I call anti Semites.
And that's
And
the thing. It's the liberal, I call it the disease of liberalism. It's what we see in America and in England. Like, who's the UK Prime Minister now? I can't pronounce his last name. Keir something. You can help me out if the name is Keir Starmer.
yeah,
he was placing the protesters against the Muslim rioters in jail, or if someone was posting on social media that they're against immigration, they're now serving jail sentences over social media posts.
In a perfect world,
This is like Nazi Germany.
yeah, in a perfect world, the King of England would annul the last election
Mhm.
and say,
Does he have the power to?
no, but
Oh, okay.
he's got a microphone,
Right, that's true.
and he should say this government is illegal. They were elected under false premises. They never told everybody that they were going to take over and then discriminate against the 90% of the population that's Christian. And so therefore, we need new elections immediately. And they've lost their right to rule. Now, the government could say we're going to arrest the king, but let's see them try to arrest the king. And but you need someone strong like the king to stand up and say this new government is illegal. We're not going to tolerate discrimination against Christians, not in a 90% Christian country.
And that's the problem with the king, though, there, because he is very pro the pro-activities of the Islamists. But back in, I forgot, it was the 70s or the 80s, he was very much supporting even Muslim terrorists. So
Okay,
I find it laughable when I have my English Jewish friends post about, oh, so the king went to some Hanukkah event. I said, do you know that he was anti-Israel for how many decades? And who he was palling around with. That research needs to be done by people who say, "Oh, he said Happy Hanukkah and he went to visit a Holocaust survivor."
right.
And
Now you're now examining how civilizations die.
right, because
When
it's coming from the top down.
yeah,
Right.
when you have intellectual corruption everywhere, plus financial corruption everywhere, and then the strong people don't stand up, and then the criminals or the pagans or the devil, whatever word, or the communists, Islamists, and globalists, whatever word you want to use for them, take over. Who's going to stop them?
Absolutely. No, that's true. And so when we were just talking or mentioning briefly about the Abraham Accords, so I sort of know the inside story. Rabbi Eli Abadi is on my advisory committee. He was very much involved with the Emirati royal family, particularly in Abu Dhabi. But at the same time, like now we're talking about trust. So, in your expert opinion, UAE, Morocco, I don't count Sudan because I know that they got added as a mercy add. I count the UAE, Morocco, and Bahrain. To me, those are the main countries of the Abraham Accords. Do you know what made them turn? Because I know that Netanyahu, for close to a decade, so as much criticism as I have of Netanyahu from his 1997 giving away 97% to Hebron, to gifting Hamas cement because he didn't want to give them uh, aid when he didn't have to, and a litany of other mistakes he's making through the war. The one thing I give him so much praise for is establishing those back channel relationships with the Arab nations when it was dangerous, when his diplomatic envoys couldn't use Israeli passports, and he was meeting in the middle of the sea on these neutral carriers. That all paved the way, and so he needs to get a lot of most of the credit for the Abraham Accords. So, do you know what made them finally turn and see the light that a relationship with Israel is advantageous?
Well, um, going back to our discussion of Iran. So we hear it's now 45 years of the rise of Iran, and they realized no one was stopping Iran, and they realized that they had to work together, the Arab states together, and the Arabs with Israel. So they basically did not trust America,
Mhm.
and were deathly afraid of Iran. And they thought that by having an agreement with Israel together, they would have I call it a mini NATO. They didn't use words like that, but let's just say a cooperation agreement, uh, both economics and defense issues, to save themselves from a growing Iran.
So
So
it's a Machiavellian move, right? The enemy of your enemy is your friend. in a
Yeah,
way. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
So it's not like they love Israel, and it's not like there's going to be intermarriage between the Jews and the Muslims. But
Mhm.
at least they're pragmatic enough to know that they can have a growing economy, they can have stronger defense ties, and like a mutual protection society. So I think it was a very good idea of President Trump and his people. And plus, there's another 10 countries that want to join the Abraham Accords as soon as we get a real leader in America.
That's true. And then also, Israel needs to negotiate those agreements on their own. I truly believe that it was, I don't know how much power Israel actually had, but the deal with Saudi Arabia could have been arranged without the US involvement. I think having the US involvement jeopardized the deal and then made them focus more on the anti Semitic two-state solution, which has always been a ploy of the left and even APAC, which I personally don't even believe should be in existence because they are working against Israel's best interests, especially pushing. I wrote a whole article about that, pushing that two-state solution that most Israelis don't want. It would be the end of Israel if that were to ever happen.
By
And
the
so,
way, it's against American national security interests. A
exactly.
two
And
state solution is viciously anti
mhm,
America, viciously anti Israel, viciously pro Islamist. So,
it should have died decades ago. I
long
don't know
time ago, long
why.
time ago.
Right. And so that's the thing. I think that Israel and Saudi Arabia could have handled it on their own without having the Biden administration anywhere close to that. But did you, just curious, have you been to Dubai yet or anywhere in the UAE since the Accords?
Yes.
Okay, so did you see? Oh, okay, and also my follow-up question: were you on a Jewish tour or were you on a non-Jewish tour?
I went there with the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. So
Okay,
we went to the Emirates, and then on a different year, we went to Saudi Arabia.
okay. So did you feel like your tour was being sugar-coated, or did you feel like you were getting the real deal? And the reason I bring it up, so I was there twice. The first time was with the American Friends of Magen David Adom, and obviously the logo of the charity is a big red Magen David. So our bus all over Abu Dhabi and Dubai had that right front center. We had an Arab driver, and he didn't have a problem with that. And so everything we were told, it was this like utopia. It's like, oh, we love Israel. Forget about all of the past, decades of poor relations. We all love Israel. Israel's like the best. We can't wait to visit. So, I was there for 4 days. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like amazing. Like, what kind of like fantasy land have I landed myself in? And then 6 months later, I came back on a non-Jewish tour. I had been on a cruise to Egypt, um, Saudi Arabia, and then Oman, Jordan, and then we ended up in UAE. And but the cruise was over, so it was just private, private tours, non-Jewish. So we had an Indian Muslim driver and a Pakistani Muslim tour guide. So they get along fabulously when not in India and Pakistan, and plus they're the same religion. And I am such a proud Jew. I always, since 2014, like, if anyone asks, like, oh, like your last name, is that Jewish? Is that Russian? I'm like, I'm a Jew. I usually wear a map of Israel necklace. Like, I have no problem saying it. But I didn't feel comfortable. Well, if asked, we would have told, but we were not asked our ethnicity. So I did not share. Like, we just, my mom and I felt like I was on the trip with my mom. We just felt like, okay, we are in a different country. We're under their watch, and we need them for safety for the next 4 or 5 days. So they didn't say anything about Israel at first, but then they took us to Sharjah. And if you've been to Sharjah, you know that's more a much more religious part of the UAE. And we went to the Islamic Civilization Museum, where they had a replica of Jerusalem, which they called Al Quds. And then our tour guide went off on Israel, said like, oh, the Jews, the Yahuds stole our land. We're going to go on this jihad. Like, he went on and on and on. And I have a feisty personality. So like I was ready to like fight him. My mom knows that about me. So she took like one look at me. It's just like, just shut up. Like don't say a word. And then you see it too. Like you see most of the population you saw, even being on any tour, most of the population of the UAE are non-Emiratis. Emiratis make up what, 12% of the population. So those are the ones who fall in line with the rulers. Everyone else, the Bangladeshis, the Iranians, the who else is there? The Indian Muslim, like everyone else, if they did not live in a police state or under a police state, they would have had those riots. They would have had, like, as we saw here and all over Europe. So in a way, coming back from a police state such as that or in Saudi Arabia, I am thankful for those police states because I think police states in the Middle East is far safer. Although look what happened in Egypt when they had a democracy, they elected a Muslim Brotherhood terrorist, Morsi. Now they're under a police state. Fine, you might not like all their rules, not you, but like the people there might not like all the rules, but they're far safer. They finally got rid of terrorism. So my question to you, and this is something that I've been pondering the past 6, 7 months, is it dangerous for Israel to be a democracy, especially during war times? Or is it the right course of action for Israel?
Well, if you look at, there's three ways to organize very large populations.
Mhm.
You can have a dictatorship. One guy makes all the decisions, which works fine until the one guy starts making mistakes. And then the country goes in a death spiral, as China is in right now. They made the brilliant decision to have mandate one child per family for 40 years.
And now
the
it's right. And now it's
right,
affecting all the males.
right, and the population's gonna. I saw some documentary on YouTube, and someone professional forecasted that over the next 100 years, China's population is going to go from 1.4 billion to 800 million, while India goes from 1.4 to 1.8 billion. So China's in the first inning of a death spiral because of this brilliant decision, right? Or how about Hitler going into Russia during the winter? That was just a brilliant decision. So, anyways,
thank God, right?
right. So you have dictatorships on one extreme, and I don't like dictatorships. And on the other extreme, you have democracies, which are basically debating societies, where people debate and debate and debate and never make any decisions. And so I'm not a big fan of democracies. What I'm a big
I'm glad because I used to be I used to love the word democracy, and then I analyzed more of the situation. I was like, wait, but this democracy is failing and that democracy is failing, right?
Yes, yeah, and you can call we're a constitutional republic. We're not a democracy, but we're failing. Okay, so whatever term you want to use, we're right now we're failing. Now, in between dictatorships and democracies, there's something that I know and love and spent 45 years of my work career in. They're called corporations. Corporations are basically half dictatorships and half democracies.
Can you give one example of a corporation?
Well, I come from the healthcare field, so
okay, you mean corporate. I thought you meant like, is there any country that maybe operates like on a corporation ideal?
Yeah, well, I'm told Singapore in its early days. You could call it a benevolent dictatorship, but they had one leader who basically ran the country, but in the interest of the country. Usually, when you have a dictator, they run it in the interest of the dictator, and so that was a special example. But if you look at corporations, Johnson Johnson's the largest in healthcare. Eli Lilly, the largest, or will be soon the largest in pharmaceuticals. You have a president, a number one, a chief executive officer, but above him is the board of directors. We don't have board of directors on top of the president in America. We have voters, but in corporations, voters vote every day. Every day you make a decision: should I buy Johnson Johnson Band-Aids or someone else's Band-Aids? You don't buy Band-Aids every 4 years. No. Whereas in democracies, you vote every 4 years. And In corporations, so the voters, the consumers are voting every single day. The board of directors is monitoring the president every single day. And there can be unions, there's government regulators. So there's a huge amount of oversight. So that the number one, the CEO can't be a dictator. There's too many constraints on that person. So I have this theory that we have to run our democracies more like corporations, where we make decisions on timely basis, because you have the dictatorships who are making 12 decisions a day to destroy us, and we can't make one decision every 4 years to save ourselves, where we're going to run out of time.
And that's true. And so President Trump, coming from a business background, a business person, makes for the best kind of president. And so it'd be wonderful if there was a rule enacted somewhere that in order to run for president, you have to have run a business.
Yes.
Non-business people cannot
Yeah.
cannot be eligible for office.
Yeah. So I'll go back to my expression. I always ask myself, what should be done about a given situation? Number one, in the world that we live in, and secondly, in the perfect world. So in the perfect world, you're perfectly correct. But we don't live in the perfect world.
Of course, right. But like it just like we have practical evidence that business people make for far more effective leaders.
Right.
If you agree with them or not, that's one thing, but they just are more efficient. They see the big picture, everything that you've mentioned. So as we wind down, I would be remiss not to ask you about the elephant in the room, which is not Iran to me, but Saudi Arabia. So I had such high hopes for Saudi Arabia right after the Abraham Accords. To me, again, you can push back. We're free to agree or disagree with each other. To me, they have been acting a bit bipolar during this war, right? Like in the beginning, they were still pushing for a two-state solution, obviously anti-Semitic as it is. But then on the other hand, they closed their airspace. When was this in April, when Iran was launching missiles to Israel? Some claim, or they claim, that they helped Israel. I think that they were helping themselves, because given how close they are to Iran, they themselves didn't want to be hit by those missiles. So if you could explain to me and the audience, do they have as large of a control as some people say that they do on the Abraham Accord nations? Did they actually, for the Abraham Accords to go through, did they have to greenlight it? And then what was their goal? Did they really want to be the cherry on top? Or are they waiting for Israel to give up even more of their land to terrorists? Then they're going to have peace with Israel. And then also the leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. I know personally, a friend of mine met him in San Francisco in 2019. She was going for a tech conference, and they had met with, it wasn't related, but in the same restaurant was Mohammed bin Salman and his party, and he invited her to sit with his group. So she went and sat, and she's a Jew. And he started talking with her, and he's like, oh, like, what's your background? What do you do for work? So she's like, oh, like, I'm Jewish. I do a lot within the tech Jewish community here in San Francisco. And he said, I love the Jewish community and I love Israel. This was 2019 when we were gearing up for the Abraham Accords. Now I look at Saudi Arabia, it's like a different Saudi Arabia than before October 7th. So if you could just shed some light, where are they? What is their goal? Is it just propaganda that they're spewing? And then they have more Israel friendly goals privately that they haven't shared yet. What is going on with Saudi Arabia?
Well, let's go back to my comment about a perfect world. So in a perfect world, Saudi Arabia wants to be friends with Israel. By the way, Israel has like a 3 or 4% unemployment rate. Any Arab country would love to have anything under 10%.
Close to that, right?
Right, because Israel's innovative, they're creative, they file patents, they create new companies, they use their brains, and so I'd say many of the Arab countries spent many of their years being jealous of Jews.
Mhm.
Now, now I think what Saudi Arabia and others are saying, I want to be like Jews. I'm not going to say that publicly. I'm not going to say that to my friends. I'm saying it to myself. I want to have an economy that grows like Israel, that
Mhm.
is innovative, that can live without being dependent on oil. So I think they want to genuinely want to be like Israel. Uh, not be Jewish,
Well,
not
yeah, yeah.
marry
Right, right,
Jewish
right, right.
between Jews and the
Mhm.
Muslims, and but but they live in a real world, so they have the devil, the largest elephant devil in the history of the world, just east of them in Iran,
Right.
and in Qatar they have the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamists that Qatar and Turkey are financing. So
But they're against, at least like the foreign minister had publicly announced that Saudi Arabia abhors Qatar. At least that's what he said. I don't know if that's true or not, but
sure,
so
sure, but pretend you're a lion tamer. I don't know how to be a lion tamer, but pretend
right.
we're a lion tamer. So you have your little whip, and you're whipping around and saying, "Stay away from me, stay away from me."
But you
You're
can't whip
whipping,
too hard because then, right.
and you're whipping Qatar and say, "Stay away from me, stay away from me." And then Turkey wants to resurrect the Ottoman Empire. So
Hmm.
you take you're running out of hands, but you take your hand and your whip and you say to Turkey, "Stay away from me, stay away from me." Meanwhile, you have your own population who is saying, "You're the king and you're living in this palace. I want to live in the palace." And so you take another, as if you had another hand, and you're whipping the population, say, "Stay away from my palace. I'm the king. You're not the king, and stay away."
So
Well,
can I just interject one point because you said you had been to Saudi Arabia and had I. Were you as surprised because having been to the UAE, obviously most of the population is not living large, but the Emiratis are. You saw how the Emiratis live. I was shocked that in Saudi Arabia there was such a large middle class and that most of the population is actually not rich. It's only the wealthy who are connected to the royal family. And obviously they have hundreds and hundreds of princes and princesses. Was that something that was surprising to you, or did you already know that coming in?
look, when you live in a dictatorship, uh, you know the expression, "It's good to be the king."
Mhm.
Okay, so I expect the leadership to live in very big palaces, and that's what I expect. Now, in America, our princes, we don't call them princes, we call them chief executive officer. When
Mhm.
you drive by Bill Gates' house, you expect it to be bigger than your house. You're not like shocked. How could Bill Gates have a house
Right. Oh no, no, I meant
42 times?
no, I meant I was shocked that the middle class was so large. Like I expected, that there's this image of Saudi Arabia that because they have so much oil, that almost everyone there is rich. You have the poor people, you obviously. So I didn't expect because our tour guide told us, by the way, the same tour guide who, when someone asked how important is Jerusalem to Islam, the tour guide, fully Muslim and the Saudi Arabian, laughed and said Jerusalem has nothing to do with Islam. So that's something else that needs to be focused on in the general media. And even amongst Jews themselves, like how many times have I been on a tour in Jerusalem where the tour guide's like, oh, like Jerusalem is important to three religions? Not true. So anyway, so he explained that the average Saudi is not like barely, making it, but has to work very, very hard in order to provide for his family. So that's something to me that I think most of the world is not aware of. That the middle class is so large, in comparison.
So look, the key point is that however big and strong you are, it is you have a lot of enemies, and
And
the
so
big.
within, so you're saying, because I didn't know this, you're saying that even within their own country, the leadership has to quell its population. Okay. See, I did not know that. Okay.
And also the Wahhabis, the religious element. Basically, Mohammed bin Salman has pushed them to the side, and basically said, "You will no longer be Islamists. We're not taking over the world, and I don't want you preaching this nonsense anymore." So
Did they
you
leave, so did they leave Saudi Arabia or are they
no
still
no There they
local.
are, but they're under the thumb
Okay.
of the king.
Mhm.
Well, as soon as the king takes his thumb off of the school or the person or the professors, whatever they call them, they'll spring back into action. So let's just say the king's juggling a whole variety of interests.
Right.
But I think he wants to be part of the Abraham Accords. He wants to be closer to Israel in many different ways. Um, in particular economically in a defense sense. And remember, the number one enemy of Muslims are the Islamists.
Of course. Actually, more isn't it? Well, now that I'm reading more about the Hindu genocide over 800 years, it's something over 400 million Muslims, 400 million Hindus were killed by Muslim rulers over 800-year period, but nearly as many Muslims were killed, from
Yeah,
their own.
right.
So Jews are not special in terms of being killed by Muslims. We're just not. We just need to find better ways of policy changes so
Yeah.
it doesn't keep happening.
The number one victim of the Islamists are Muslims.
Mhm.
So Israel is basically protecting the Muslims. America, Christians are protecting the Muslims from the Islamists.
From their own. Let me ask you a question, something like we didn't talk before. How entrenched is Israel? Your best guesstimate, of course. How entrenched is Israel within Saudi Arabia, would you surmise?
Well, Israel has, there's 193 countries in the world or in the UN. And Israel has relations in, I think it's 140 countries. So the other 50 or so countries, about, let's say 15 are pure unadulterated enemies.
Mhm.
So that leaves maybe 35 countries that Israel has no formal relations with, but they're not full enemies. And Israel has two foreign ministries. One is the regular foreign ministry, and the other is out of the Mossad. So the Mossad, our equivalent would be CIA, actually has embassies. You wouldn't know it.
Oh, I
It
didn't know
would
that.
that doesn't say embassy on it, and but they would have someone who would look like an ambassador and a staff with them,
Oh,
and
interesting.
so
I thought they were just rogue undercover agents that meld within the population.
yeah. So Israel has official, quiet, but
Mm.
official relations with, let's just say, 35 countries. And they have the equivalent of an ambassador running the show for each country. But they never talk about it, but they're in communications with those countries. So I think that's very healthy and smart of the Israeli government to do that.
And is it true that I read somewhere, again, was before the war, that they Israel was even sending like security personnel, not military, but like tech security personnel to help the Saudis, and they were not living there. They're not residents, but they would come on multi-month assignments. So something was definitely going on in the background. I just was not sure to which extent
Well, I
is
think that's one of the reasons why these 35 or whatever countries want to have relations with Israel. They, in particular, want security relations because they want Israel to protect them. Now,
right.
they'll never say that publicly,
Of course.
but Israel, as I said, Israel's protecting many Muslim countries, many Muslim leaders, many Christian leaders, and I'm sure Hindu leaders, and is getting no credit for it. And Israel, I'm sure, doesn't want any credit for it. But this is one of the ways they show various countries how important Israel can be to them.
And so is Saudi Arabia waiting for the war to be over to strike a deal that hopefully does not include, and here's another question though. So I really hope that Israel does not accept a deal that includes anything about a two-state solution. Like it doesn't matter that it's peace with Saudi Arabia. I think Israel was doing fairly okay without having formal relations, without Saudi Arabia. But to sacrifice such a security risk for Israeli citizens, it just would not, like to me, it would be a non-starter. So do you think that Saudi Arabia is going to drop that anti-Semitic demand? Was that just for show, or do they really mean it? And then second part, are they going to try again with Israel post-war, or are they waiting for Trump to return to office?
I think all of the above. I think they want Trump back in office. I think they want Iran blown up. Everyone wants Iran blown up. 80% of Iran wants Iran blown up.
So,
I'm
so
talking
that's the
about,
thing. Oh, right. So that's the thing. So, like, why can't all these countries? I know you said, like, I like about how you frame it. There's the ideal world, and then there's the reality. So, in an ideal world, all of these countries, because there are numerous countries who want Iran back to pre-terrorist, times. Why can't they all just join forces and help these protesters so we can look like the protesters topple their regime, right? Like there's going to be no pointing fingers at foreign intervention, but these protesters can't do it on their own. And Israel can't just go and, well, I mean, I guess it can strike the Ayatollah, but it's a much harder feat than paying some ICRG agents to go after Hania. So somehow those protesters have to be utilized. And with so much power, I mean, you can think of maybe half the world, right? Like half of Europe is against Iran and America, and half of the Middle East. Why can't they just partner together
well, go back in a perfect world,
in a perfect
half,
world, right?
half if there's 193 countries in the world, let's just say 100 of them are democracies. In a perfect world, all of the 100 democracies would send airplanes up into the air and directed by America and would blow up Iran's nuclear sites, their oil refinery, their oil export ability, while the people rush to the palaces and take over the government. That's a perfect world.
But technically, Israel, well, can Israel blow up their nuclear facilities? Because Israel did that to Iraq. And then the American soldiers were thanking them because they said, had we invaded Iraq with a nuclear government, it would have been a far different outcome.
Yeah, it's just that Iran has learned its lessons from
Mhm.
Iraq and has dispersed its nuclear capabilities. Uh, there's something like 50 different sites that Israel has to blow up. Now, they're not all equal.
Right.
Maybe 10 of them have to be blown up. I don't know the answer. But yeah, someone has to blow them up, those nuclear sites up.
But do you think okay? So what's more
It's
important?
America's job. It's
So,
America's job.
so okay, so here's my question. So what's more important, blowing up the nuclear facilities or taking out the Ayatollah?
They go hand in hand.
Hmm. So
So
so which comes first? The Ayatollah and the
no, I
nuclear,
think
or reverse?
the nuclear sites have to go first.
Mhm. Right, because
Because,
without them, they have no leverage on the world stage.
right,
Mhm.
right. And that's why they fight to maintain the nuclear sites because they need that leverage so they can blackmail the world.
That's true. It's an excellent point. And so going back to Saudi Arabia, because this has been pressing for many months on my mind, do you think that they would ever drop the two-state solution clause, even with Trump and post-war with Israel? Or is this something that is non-negotiable for them?
Well, the two-state solution, quote, solution is a mortal risk to Saudi Arabia
And how so?
because the second state, you were talking about elephants. Right now in the Middle East, there's two gigantic elephants. One says Iran on it, and one says Qatar or the Muslim Brotherhood on it.
Mhm.
These two terror organizations will immediately invade any Palestinian state, like within seconds. So, Palestinian state cannot last for more than one day. And then it'll be invaded by either the Iranian elephant
Of course,
or the
right.
Muslim Brotherhood elephant. Well, that's not in Saudi Arabia's interest
Mhm.
to have Iran take over the Palestinian state or to have Qatar take over
Right.
the state. So it's in nobody, by the way, it's not in the interest of the Arabs, the so-called Palestinians. It's not in their interests.
Right.
It's not in anyone's interest except the terror organizations. So Iran would say, yes, I want a two-state solution so I can take it over.
So
It's not
Saudi
going to,
Arabia, so you're saying Saudi Arabia is what, but then who is it paying lip service to when it's announcing to the world that, okay, we'll make peace with Israel, but we're looking for a two-state solution to be in place first? Who are they trying to appease? Is it they're trying to pay lip service to Iran and Qatar so that it's going to be less of a blow to them, or
no,
am I missing something?
no, they're paying lip service to their own people.
Okay.
They've
Right.
miseducated their people for years and years and years, approximately 1,400 years to be exact. So you don't want
And
the people.
even with the MBS, it's easier to say than his full name. So even with MBS removing anti-Israel, anti-Semitic materials from the education system, right? I mean, he only started doing that about 2 years
But
ago.
it
It
takes
hasn't trickled down yet.
yeah, it takes 20 years for a 5-year-old to become 25.
That's true.
Okay,
Mhm.
so it takes 2 generations to denazify a country.
Mhm.
Okay, so MBS has been at it for maybe 10 years. He has another 30 years to go to denazify Saudi Arabia.
And
Okay,
probably, I would venture to say even less than 10 years because he had those dizzying policies maybe like 5, 6 years ago, especially towards Israel, maybe like four years
yeah,
ago. So
right,
yeah, he's in his infancy stage, is what you're saying.
right.
Okay.
It's
So is there, but is there is hope, or is that something that we should table
there's
at this moment?
no there's hope
With Saudi Arabia?
if America gets its act together on November 5th, and if Israel gets its act together over the next 6 months,
Mhm.
and if together they blow up the nuclear sites of Iran within 12 months. When you go look out a year from today or two, I get very optimistic.
Good.
With
Okay.
but a lot of bad things have to happen. Well, good and bad things have to happen over the next 12 months to cause people to realize that America's back in town, Israel's back in the saddle, and Iran is in the dustbin of history.
That there's
So
no other choice because
no other choice.
we have reached rock bottom.
Look, it's World War III is a repeat of World War II.
Mhm.
So if we were talking in 1942, and I said over the next 3 years we have to blow up Germany and we have to blow up Japan, then you say to me, "Oh, is there a third way?" No, or second way? No, there's no second or third way. Okay, these Islamo-Nazi death cults have to be destroyed.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I thank you so much for your time. I know, oh my gosh, we had over a 2 hour, absolutely great discussion. And thank you for shedding light on topics that I'm fascinated with. I know the audience would like more information on. And having you as an expert, you truly went into depth. So thank you so much. And I look forward to staying in touch and looking forward to your webinars.
Yes,
Uh,
and people should sign up for my website, savethewest.com. They'll get my articles that I publish every 2 weeks. They can buy my book, The Multi-Front War, for $20. I tell people that book is the biggest bargain you'll ever buy in your life because it cost me $400 a book to produce, and you have to only pay 20 because of all the time that I didn't get paid for. So all the time, energy, and thinking that went into the book, the $400 a book, you only have to pay 20 to get that book, and I lose 380. But don't worry about me. Just read the book and learn.
and educate and then share with others.
Right.
Exactly. So we're going to link all of that under the podcast episode, just for people to have more information. So thank you again. Thank you so much. This has been fabulous.
Okay. Pleasure to be with you today.
Have a good night.
Okay. So long.